I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about what's happening in the aftermath of the LA wildfires, we have with us Ann Lee, who is a co-founder and current CEO of CORE Response. CORE is an incredible organization that Ann founded with actor Sean Penn, and they do work all over the world. And now they're doing work in their own backyard. So Ann, it's great to see you and talk with you, but under these circumstances, I know it's really hard.
It is, and more so when you're sort of in that weird space of going home and worried about your family and then also responding. I mean, it's kind of calling back to what we experienced in COVID as well and compelling us to be very robust in our response.
You know, Ann, I saw a headline in the LA Times today, and it basically says California is built to burn. And it talks about the Bel Air fire, which was known as the big one. That was back in, I think, the 1960s, 61. This is, yes, November 61. This is so bad what's happened. I think over 16,000 structures, killed at least 29 people around Pacific Palisades and Altadena. What are you and CORE doing to try to help in this immediate aftermath? And what are some of the priorities?
So right now we have a multi-pronged approach. We're looking at cash distribution and cash programming as our immediate response. So that is with and through local organizations, churches, community leaders to essentially target those who have been directly affected to provide them cash immediately. As time goes on, that's going to be accompanying a number of other activities that we're also bringing online. So the cash provides immediate support, but it's also flexible enough for us as we go along, can shift to the changing needs of people and businesses, because we know that it's not just about the families and the homes, but it's also the businesses that have been destroyed. We're also doing benefits navigation. That's going to be online in the next 2 to 3 weeks, essentially holding people's hands through this very complex process to navigate sort of what are all the resources that they have access to. How do they, navigate FEMA? How do they get, WIC and SNAP if they're eligible? How can they be supported through other organizations, whether they're housing rights organizations or SBA loans and so on and so forth? Because a lot of the folks are just so overwhelmed and inundated with information, misinformation. So being able to be physically with them, hold their hands through this process, and especially targeting for us is really important. Folks who don't necessarily trust the system or elderly who might not have the technological capabilities to just do their own research and have this access. So that's quite important to us. And that benefits navigation will then turn into longer term, that's like a 2-year process of case management. That is a setup process through the state, through the federal government, through FEMA, which handholds with case managers, specifically families, to get through the process to rebuild or to kind of bring them back to where they were before. It takes a long time, but it is much more tailored, and it's an advocacy role as well, where you're basically getting them the maximum amount that they really should be getting through a very, again, complex system. And all of this is kind of at the same time where we know and have experience in the space of sort of debris management. And so we are looking at how can we support right now the government, who is doing their best to kind of clear out those homes to basically accelerate that process. Because right now, as folks are even selling their parcels that are burnt out, they don't have the luxury of time to wait out that cleaning process and rebuilding process.
So obviously the homes in Pacific Palisades, there was tremendous value there. There's tremendous value in the community of Altadena. These are people who have owned their homes for a very, very long time. It's an enormous amount of money to rebuild. And, one of the things I keep hearing is, should people rebuild? Specifically, should they rebuild in Palisades because it's built basically in a fire zone, or what could be a fire zone and what was a fire zone? So what's the thinking around rebuilding?
Having seen disasters in so many different places, in the Philippines after Haiyan, in Haiti after the earthquake, in so many of these places where that human settlements probably should not be because of climate change or the high risk. The issue is over and over and over again, you see that you cannot stem the flow of human settlements in these high risk areas. What you see, unfortunately, is that there is no mitigating support to these communities to make them safer. Here in Los Angeles, I do hope that there will be that type of guidance and support to allow for what's inevitably going to happen, which is building back, but we need to be smarter about it and with better guidelines and much more sort of, safer planning around it, which I think is totally feasible. It is 1000% feasible. And that should be what we're targeting for, not just, okay, let's just build quickly and as we have been. But, after so many years of knowing that California is very risk prone, not just with fires, but there is a way to do this smarter.
So, yeah, I mean, it's not just fires. In fact, this week, weather forecasters are, we're talking on Monday, February 10th. Forecasters are saying there's rainstorms that are coming to Los Angeles, which we all know means mudslides.
Mm-hmm.
Mudslides are so dangerous in this sense. What are some of the things you just mentioned mitigating some of these risks? Because we know people want to live in these highly coveted places. They want to live among the nature because the nature is so incredible. They want an ocean view. We could go on and on. What are some of the things that government needs to do to mitigate the risks that these people are going to be undertaking in building their homes back?
I so strongly believe in carrots and sticks. There's so many ways in which that we can learn from even Hurricane Sandy that hit New York, and ways in which that people and the government has been using sort of incentives and disincentives in terms of rebuilding in certain areas and trying to build in structures to kind of, again, keep these communities safer in the future. There is so much learning that we have of like just absolute areas that should not be rebuilt on, but there's also ways in which we can do soil retention walls, going back to native plants that are drought resistant, more fire resistant, basically everything from controlled fires in some cases, again, not in sort of high density populated areas, but there's so many ways in which we can be learning from all of the things that we have at our fingertips now that will help guide sort of how we should be building back in these places. I think right now it's so early on. People are still kind of in this processing period. It's hard for us to start talking about these things, but these things are kind of already being discussed from just folks that see, in a year from now, when rebuilding is going to start, what can we do to make sure that we can make these communities safer than what they were before?
Some Americans who aren't familiar with Los Angeles and particularly with these zones, like why couldn't the fire engines tap into water sources that, kept flowing? Are there good answers to that?
I think that there's sometimes these things that happen that we really glom onto as like representative of the whole when it's not quite true. I do know that that did happen and that was true, but would that have been the explanation of how many homes and how much had been burnt down? No. It was definitely another contributing factor, but it wasn't the whole reason of why we saw the amount of destruction that we saw. It's almost this, we want to kind of simplify things down to things that we can kind of blame or just point to as like, that's what went wrong. But it is so much more complex than that. And I don't think that any single group, as we saw in so many of these overwhelming crises of like COVID and what have you, it's never one single group that can manage a crisis on its own. And that's why it's so important for us to look at this as a much more holistic issue that needs to touch on several groups. It's the emergency management agency, it's the fire department, it's also the complex sort of politics between LA City, LA County, and then California, the state. It's all those factors that play into it. But at the end of the day, it's not one entity that we should be looking for in terms of blame or a single incident, nor is it going to be the solution. It has to be sort of this group effort, which makes it very difficult because trying to get several different visions and people to work together, as you can imagine, is always very hard.
So, what have you found is the most effective way to help families who've been impacted?
What we're finding right now is I think we've gotten so used to, especially with often in these disasters, the immensity of the number of people that are affected, that, we kind of go to solutions that are very, very quick and kind of, immediate, which is important, but we lose that human component to it. And in this case, we're talking about 18,000 structures, right? 150,000 people displaced. That is a much smaller disaster than, what you see in, let's say, a million people who've been displaced, things that we've seen in global crises. Not to say that it's easier at all by any means, but this allows for a much more targeted and much more sort of tailored approach that I think is needed. And what that should look like is really understanding sort of the prioritization of the areas that need additional support and tailoring those needs to those families. We have families in Altadena who have been there for generations, who had rental income and were relying on that rental income and owned their houses outright over several generations. Now they're displaced into homes, into apartment complexes that cost $7,000 a month to rent for their families, for just one family, when they have five families that they're kind of managing. It's an impossible answer for us to put them in a place that is unaffordable for maybe a year or two. We are not looking enough at looking at what kind of housing solutions do we have that will really, really support these families over the next 2 years. What can we do to ensure that these families are not giving up and selling their homes, which we're seeing on the news already that's happening, that will fundamentally push out these families from their homes that they've owned for decades? So that's where our thinking is right now, where we need a lot more sort of out of the box thinking. But as everyone knows, it is very difficult. California is particularly unique in its way of working with contractors and the regulations and a lot of sort of bureaucracy that's there that needs to be really, really looked at in this emergency situation.
Yeah, you need to streamline it in order to get things done in an emergency. And let's face it, California is one of our biggest states. It has huge bureaucracy. It has a huge amount of money coming in and out. And real estate prices in California are not cheap, especially in Los Angeles.
Oh my God, the housing pressure was there beforehand. And now we're going to just push out these families forever out of the places that they've been in for 100 years. I'm looking at specifically the Black community in Altadena. And that's something that I think would be a terrible mistake and something that we would really be remiss at not addressing immediately.
It reminds me a lot of Hurricane Katrina and the families in the lower Ninth Ward whose homes were washed away. The same thing, second, third generation, fourth generation homeowners owned their homes outright. Difficult place to get insurance because of, the environment, same as California. And yet, New Orleans really, it took a while, but New Orleans is rebuilt.
Mhm.
Government helped New Orleans rebuild and create a pumping system that keeps these homes safe, but there's still work to be done. Nothing's been done, on the outer wetlands, which clearly needs to be done. This feels like such a massive undertaking, but at least in Hurricane Katrina, the city and the government proved that it can be done. Does that give you hope?
It does. I mean, you couldn't survive in this sector if you weren't optimistic and hopeful. So I do think that there is a space and an openness in the county, in the city, and at the state level of, okay, we are going to push the envelope. Just with even the timelines that seem so difficult. Governor Newsom said, in a month, we're going to clear out all the hazardous waste materials on these plots. I mean, in a month, that is insane. But we're watching it and it's moving quite quickly. And there's a lot of acceleration on a number of things that would normally take, 6 months. So in that sense, it is very, very hopeful to see that there is good positive movement. So we're continuing to sort of watch and push for out of the box solutions to be inclusive of the support that needs to happen, not just within the typical state and government apparatus, but outside as well, because again, all hands on deck.
I hear you. Let's talk about for a second people saying, okay, I can't deal with this anymore. We're going to sell plot of land that no longer has our home. Are they getting fair value for that at least, or is it just a real buyer's market?
It's a buyer's market. I mean, I just saw the news that a parcel was sold for $500,000 in Altadena. And that to me is insane. It's insane. That is disaster gentrification. That is preying on these victims. That is not market value. And just to watch that happen is heartbreaking.
Is that happening in Palisades too, where, people had these really extraordinary homes, extremely expensive, coveted real estate, yet we've had this massive disaster and it's going to take a lot to rebuild that neighborhood. Same thing there?
It is. It's less reported, but it is happening.
And what can be done about this?
This is where, again, we need to look at how we can support these families in the rebuilding process over the next 2 years so that they're not overwhelmed and just want to say, like, okay, I'm just moving out of here. I can't do this anymore. So, what are the housing solutions that we could be providing that will allow them to live and continue while they're rebuilding? Also, give them the support, the tailored support that they need to be able to clear out their homes. They have to get reconnected into all the systems and into all the water and the power. That's going to take a few years. Figure out how they're going to get money to not just rebuild, but is insurance going to cover them again? Are their kids going to go to the same school that they've been going to when you don't have a school? Like, these are all questions that they're continuing to ask, and it becomes so overwhelming that they just want to give up and sell and move someplace else and start from zero. So how can we hold their hand and give them the information and continue to do so? Not just a one-shot thing, but have a regular dialogue with them. And that's what we're trying to figure out. We want to have a benefits navigation place in 3 churches in the Black area of Altadena that can regularly be in dialogue with them of, like, what are your needs? Here's all the resources that are available, not just through us, but through other organizations in the state, the city, the government, everything. Because this is a hand-holding that needs to happen over the next few years. That resources are there, they're not enough, but there are resources.
There's some people who are even asking if California residents are entitled to insurance. Seems pretty ridiculous to even talk about it, but I have to ask, if they can't get insurance payments that are fair, how could they possibly be expected to recover?
Yeah, I mean, that's the difficult part in this, and where strongly this is where government needs to step in. Insurance companies stopped covering some of these houses, a year, 2 years before the fires, and then you're kind of left without a choice after having lived there for, X amount of years. There has to be, as we've seen in other places, some basic level of insurance that the government can also bridge gap and also address in this case of the payments that these communities deserve with their insurance policies. And again, that's where the advocacy piece is so important. We're talking to this lovely grandmother, Gloria, who's in her 70s, and she's navigating the insurance companies and trying to understand sort of what does her policy allow her to actually ask for. It's like there's that level of just basic handholding that needs to happen so that they don't get cut short.
So, Anne, the disasters generated a substantial amount of media coverage. Some of this has been linked to the economic status of these areas. There was a huge concert in LA just last week, which we've been spotlighting on our newsletter here. Also telling people if they want to help, they can provide aid to CORE, that CORE can help others. What impact do you think all of this media coverage has had on the response and the recovery? Has it been helpful? Has it been, an obfuscation, somewhere in between?
I think it's been incredibly helpful, whether we like it or not in our sector. The media often really drives funding and support to communities. It is a thing that we've understood, and it can be frustrating sometimes. For example, when CORE was working in Sudan, there's barely any coverage there. We're trying to just support the communities. It's one of the worst humanitarian crises that's happening right now.
Completely buried in the news.
Completely buried in the news, and what's happening right now in the DRC. So it's unfortunately the media drives so much of the funding and so much attention and support. In this case, it's worked in everyone's favor. I think it's inevitable. It is such a major US city. It has so much access to media centers and representatives. So in this case, it's been so helpful because what I'm hoping is that, as you know, after 2 weeks, usually, or maybe a month after a crisis hits, out of the media, out of people's minds, out of people's hearts. I think that here it might be different. And I do hope that the media continues to tell the stories and helps sort of shows the process and how long it takes for the recovery effort and how much really the funding was needed in that recovery phase. In the beginning, yes, it's important, but the recovery phase is the hardest piece. And having that regularized support is so needed. So I do hope that the media support continues.
And just in closing, what can our listeners do to help CORE and other organizations in Los Angeles with the mission?
I would say cash is king. We support cash programming to get families with cash immediately. I think also we would love to see volunteers, people who want to see sort of, their efforts have immediate impact on these families. We invite people to come and help us with distributions that we do, as well as signing people up to the cash programming. And then we'll need volunteers for the benefits navigation, but it's sustained volunteerism, not just a one-off, but folks that can really, really sort of stick with it, over the course of the next year. And I think just raising awareness on what's happening and being supportive of the communities that are getting inevitably pushed out in the communities that they've been living in for the last 100 years.
Well, Anne, thank you very much. Our great producer, David, is going to put CORE's information in the notes, and we will be thinking about you, and we'll do all we can to help spread the word. Please, please be safe and continue to help these poor families.
Thank you so much for having us.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.